I joined the Navy. 4 days in, they said, does anyone want to be a squad leader? And I was an athlete growing up, and I was a team captain. Anyone want to be a squad leader? And I put my hand up. And the guy next to me said, buddy, what are you doing? Don't you know the Navy stands for never again volunteer yourself? You better put your hand down before you get put in charge of something. But sure enough, I was put in charge of a group of about 20 people. And it was, help the person learn their right from their left when somebody's screaming at them. It's kind of what it turned out to be. Help them learn how to march and learn how to turn and learn how to make a bunk and fold T-shirts and do all these detail-oriented things. But from that point, throughout the entirety of my career, I was responsible for someone else. And what I have learned in leading, guiding, grooming, creating an environment of growth for people is that trust is crucial.
Hello, listener, and welcome back once again to Leading with Integrity. And today on the podcast, I am honored to welcome a remarkable leader, a pioneer, and a veteran of 33 years in the US Navy. I'm joined by Raymond Kemp. He started his career journey as a data processor in the Navy back in 1986, and his career was quite often an uphill battle against racial discrimination. But his resilience and perseverance propelled him from almost day one to an extraordinary culmination of his career as the first Black Fleet Master Chief of Naval Forces Europe and Africa. After an illustrious and remarkable career in the Navy, he retired in 2019, just in time for the COVID pandemic. Today, he helps leaders with their communication skills, their resilience, and improving their leadership. He's also an author, and he was appointed by President Biden to the American Battle Monuments Commission. So it's fair to say he's a pretty busy guy. Today, we'll be talking about all of those career experiences and more, his views on change and how best to adapt to it, because after all, his career has spanned some pretty big changes, both in the military, the Navy, and in wider society as well. We'll also be talking about his leadership lessons, of course, and his insights into life in general. So it's going to be a really great conversation, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. So without further ado, let's get him on the show.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Raymond, thank you so much for joining me this morning at 4 o'clock in the morning for you as well, no less. So that's very keen. Welcome to Leading with Integrity. It's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much, David. It is 04:15 here in the central portion of the USA. I'm in Dallas, Texas, and honored to be here with you.
Well, it's an honor to have you as well. And to get us started, I'm going to hand over to you for a bit to give the listeners a bit of a potted history of your career, your background, what you do today, and why you do it.
Sure. Okay. So I'll start in reverse if that's all right. So I'm an author, just finished a book. I'm a keynote speaker, and I'm an executive coach and trainer. I have a measure of experience in building resilience and loyalty within organizations. And oftentimes large and small organizations call me in to speak and train and help them develop a measure of resilience that increases the productivity for their organizations. I've been doing that for about 4 years since I retired. And I've been doing that simultaneous to an appointment by President Joe Biden. He's the U.S. president. He appointed me to the American Battle Monuments Commission. And what that is, it's a commission that takes care of the cemeteries and monuments around the world. There are 26 cemeteries, about 31 monuments in 17 different countries. And in 100 years ago, the War Department established the American Battle Monuments Commission, because if you think back, David, to the time when, World War I, we didn't have the technology to take the bodies of those who had fallen, back to the States necessarily. And so what would happen is there would be makeshift grave sites and places where we would keep the bodies, and some that would come back, and then others we would be allowed just through the agreement with those countries. Interesting how we could agree in war times in those days, but we would have cemeteries that were built there. Move on into World War II, the same thing happened. We didn't have the technology to repatriate those who had fallen. And so what we did, and again, a very honorable thing that was done, is that we have agreements in various different countries, including the UK. Exactly a year ago, I was in the Brookwood American Cemetery in the UK and had the opportunity to see an amazing facility. 100 years ago, we were given the assignment to ensure that time does not dim the glory of the deeds of those who had fallen. And so the facilities are just absolutely amazing. And so when President Biden came into office, the way that works is they appoint people to various different things. And I had the honor of that appointment. And then what led to that was my career in the Navy. So I did over 3 decades in the United States Navy, culminating as the first Black person to be selected as the Fleet Master Chief of Navy Europe and Navy Africa. So for your listeners, that's about 60,000 people between the 2 continents and the waters that surround it. And in the U.S. Navy, a senior enlisted leader is that person who has free reign to traverse the ranks of the organization, from the most senior admiral to the most junior firemen, airmen, seamen that we have. To see the command master chief or a master chief talking to those folks is never a surprise. The ability to traverse, again, the organization leads it to be a very esteemed position. And I was very much so honored to make it to that position. And then I'm from a little town in Oklahoma, the very center of the United States. And that is where I got my foundation of my personal standards. So I left the city that I'm from at the age of 17. So 17 years old. Graduated 30 days out of what we call high school. It's a 12-year learning experience. And then after that, my mother had to sign for me to have permission to go, because in the United States, you have to be 18 for your signature to really to carry real weight. And because I wasn't 18 yet, my mother had to sign for me to go, and off I went. And who knew that 33 years would come out of an intentional desire to leave the town I was from and do something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, quite a story, definitely. I mean, President Biden then, so being appointed by the president, I mean, that's pretty impressive credential there. I mean, what was that like? Did you get to meet him, or was it a remote thing? Or
I tell you, I appreciate you asking that question. So an interesting thing about my career is that when I was born in the 60s, raised in the 70s, joined the Navy in the 80s. And so Ronald Reagan was the president when I joined the Navy. And I had the unusual opportunity to be in the environment, not necessarily shake everyone's hand, but be in the environment with every president, from Ronald Reagan all the way to President Obama. Matter of fact, quick, funny, what I think to be an interesting story. My niece, when President Obama was elected, I had the opportunity. I was stationed in Washington, D.C., and I was with my nieces, and they said, "Uncle Raymond, are you going to get a chance to meet Barack Obama? Are you going to get a chance to meet the president?" And I was like, "Do you mean, is he going to get a chance to meet me? Am I going to meet him? I mean, let me tell you something. I've been doing this for 24 years. He had a speech. He did a year in Congress, and y'all elected him. Is he going to get to meet me is the question." And she goes running to my cousin, and she's like, "Daddy, Uncle Raymond said, is the president going to get to meet him?" And he looks at me and he shakes his head, and I look at him and I'm like, you already know magic happens. And so sure enough, I was appointed as the Armed Forces Inauguration Committee member for President Obama, who was our 44th president and our 56th inauguration, because, some presidents do more than one term. And not everybody had the opportunity to go do stuff. So my nieces and my cousins and the children and all the friends had a chance to go to the inaugural concert, which was on the mall, which we had never had before. My daughter Mahogany and I were on the cover of the New York Post in a photo that they took of us at the children's inaugural ball. And once the the hubbub was over, I had a chance to see my niece again, and she said, "Uncle Raymond." I said, "I know," but that was my first opportunity to meet Joe Biden and Dr. Jill Biden. And again, brief interactions, handshakes and thank you for what you do type of events. The inaugural ball was maybe a little bit more than that, but still, that was my only interaction. Once my career was over with, then he ran for president and was elected. The way it works is that there are many offices that need to be filled. There's an administration that needs to be filled. And based on my career and the opportunity for me to join a group called the National Security Leaders for America, there was a small pool of people that would, I guess some would call trusted, to go into positions like that. And it just so happens that my name was on the list. So I got a phone call from the White House personnel office, and they said, "Hey, you've been nominated for appointment, right? So your name has been floated, and here's the way the process works." And so they do a background check and so forth, and the appointment goes in. So very honored to have the opportunity to continue to be with my brothers and sisters in arms who went before me. And that, to me, is something I'm very humbled by.
I can only imagine, yeah. I mean, it's nice to think, though, that he remembered meeting you and that's why you got the job.
And quietly I tell myself that story. It was handshake, It was that eye contact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't know that's not true.
True. And one thing I will say, he is, on a one-on-one conversation, we'd say he's brilliant, quick-minded, very alert, very present in an engagement. The interesting interaction is he's a grip and grab guy, so that handshake and that firm, grasp, or that connection, because I believe there's truly a love language of physical touch. And so for him to express, his level of care, one thing he does is shake hands, look you in the eye, and, maybe grab your arm, touch your shoulder, whatever the case may be. And it's always really sincere. And so thank you for saying that, because in the back of my mind, I've always thought, he's got to remember, because we did have a moment. So anyway, I appreciate that.
Well, I think you're a memorable guy. I mean, there's no reason to assume he doesn't remember you.
Very true. I mean, except that he meets millions of people.
Well, yeah, that's a good point as well. Fair enough. Yeah,
I believe in 6 degrees of separation, and he's definitely bringing my number up.
Well, yes,
down to connection.
Yeah, there is that. Let's not dwell on the probabilities. Let's just assume the optimistic reading of that.
Let's bask in the sunlight.
Indeed. So 33 years in the Navy. First of all, that's particularly joining in the 80s as well. That's an interesting period to be serving in the armed forces, particularly in the US. So quite a few political challenges, shall we say, is probably the politest way of saying it.
It's very polite. Very polite. There definitely was.
Yeah. So, I mean, during that time and with some of those things, how did your leadership style evolve, particularly in the face of things like the racial discrimination that was, so I understand, was quite common in the forces then? Major policy changes as well. Don't ask, don't tell. That was the big one in the news at the time. I just about remember that. Yeah, tell us more.
One thing I know is that amongst the military members, right? So the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines at the time. Now we have the Space Force. There was a lot of back and forth, particularly the Navy and the Marine Corps. A lot of jostling, between the two. Of course, being in the Navy, we are the only service that walks on water, so let that be known. But we also were the ones who thought we were. I thought, again, as a Navy member, I'm believing in our creed and living that life. And what I realized is that every service has something really, really special to bring. Every service, and I don't mean just in the combat perspective, though we all are agile, mobile, and hostile when necessary. There are different perspectives of how to maneuver through challenges. And so when I think about first joining and the fact, so if 20 years before I joined, really 15, but 20 years before I joined is the era where, if your listeners think about 1966 in the United States, there was a lot of civil rights arguments and fights that were going on. The police were literally letting police dogs, German shepherds, bite and attack and try to control crowds filled with women and children. They were taking fire hoses with a high level of pressure to, spray people who were exercising their constitutional right to assemble. And without any warning or any care for the lives of those who were assembling, it was grotesque. And 20 years later, there I am in the Navy, and there were men who were age enough to have participated in that, who were still in the Navy. There were men who perhaps were young teenagers or young boys who participated in one way in those type of events, who were now in leadership in the Navy and in middle management in the Navy. And so those were the people who were leading. The Navy was one of the last services to integrate. And so definitely one of the last services to integrate particular jobs. So Black people have been fighting in the Department of Defense and in various different war capacities since America began. In fact, arguably some of the first shots during the Civil War and the Revolutionary War were fired by men of color. Well, when I joined, that residue, as you can imagine, was just all over the place. And the number of occasions where there was just open discrimination was really, really surprising to me. Because as a young man in 1986, when I first joined, I thought, well, this is a meritocracy. I'm going to have the opportunity to just do my best and be recognized and so forth. And that wasn't quite the case. David, in America, there is a word that is so polarizing, we don't even use the word. The word is so polarizing, we, instead of using the word, which is openly used in my youth, instead of using the word, we say it's the N word. And so in those days, I was brought up in an environment where that word was slung around to the left and to the right very openly. And in 1986, again, it was the first year that Martin Luther King's birthday was a holiday. So I was of the mindset of, we're making progress. We're going, to another level. And then there were a few individuals who viciously made me remember that there's still part of that old America around. So when it comes to leadership style, when it comes down to navigating those hardships, there has definitely been a growth in my perspective. Thinking meritocracy, by enter into the organization, thinking just do your best and see what happens. And those challenging things that came into place, that came upon me, caused me to think a little dark and think, okay, by any means necessary, I will do what I need to do to, survive and to get ahead of others and so forth. But making my way into the leadership ranks, I realized that just like in many other sectors of society, there's people there. And when people are peopling, as my daughter would say, when people are peopling, then it's important to figure out, okay, what's best for you to navigate through. So my perspective on just self-esteem came from two, from a number, but I'll speak right now about two just fierce angels. And my mother was one of the toughest and most fierce people I ever met. I mean, she's now passed away for over 30 years, but she was the type of person that just didn't take any BS from anybody. She was brilliant, just very, very well read, always knew her stuff and just walked with an air of confidence. And she told me when I was young, she said, you can be as good as anybody else. You just have to put in the work. You just have to study and learn and grow and be agile and continuing to improve. And my grandmother also fierce in a very different way, but fierce nonetheless. She encouraged me with language of, you have the ability, Raymond, she told me, you have the ability to see things that others don't. And that is going to be used to your advantage. What I didn't know at the time, David, is that I had a pretty high level of ADHD. And so I could pay attention to a lot of things at the same time, but I was also, the H in ADHD is hyperactivity, right? So that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So there I was, just hands in the air, moving fast and doing stuff. But instead of being criticized for it, my grandmother said, you have a special ability. And I believed them. I believed both of them. And so that ADHD, which some would frown upon, because we didn't have any medication, by the way. I'm from middle America, which is the South. And so our discipline, the medication, instead of, Concerta or Adderall or whatever they give children these days, what we had was switches and belts. So the capital punishment, that went along with ADHD was just a whole different thing than what we have right now. But as I made my way, into, as I matured and made my way into adulthood, I realized that ADHD is really a superpower. And so I can notice things about people when it comes to tendencies and patterns, and then adjust my communication and my dealings with them very rapidly. And so what happened for me, though, is standing, on in the forest, that the two seeds that were planted in my mind from my mother and my grandmother, I'm standing in the forest that those seeds yielded, then I was able to communicate with people at their level, create an environment of trust and encouragement rapidly, express a measure of care, right? Because people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And then take that and apply it to how I interacted with people. Now, I joined the Navy. 4 days in, they said, does anyone want to be a squad leader? And I was an athlete growing up, and I was a team captain. Anyone want to be a squad leader? And I put my hand up. And the guy next to me said, buddy, what are you doing? Don't you know the Navy stands for never again volunteer yourself? You better put your hand down before you get put in charge of something. But sure enough, I was put in charge of a group of about 20 people. And it was, help the person learn their right from their left when somebody's screaming at them, kind of what it turned out to be. Help them learn how to march and learn how to turn and learn how to make a bunk and fold t-shirts and do all these detail-oriented things. But from that point throughout the entirety of my career, I was responsible for someone else. And what I have learned in leading, guiding, grooming, creating an environment of growth for people is that trust is crucial. Not only is trust extremely important, consistency is very important. And so going into the Navy and the changes that come along with it, because to your point, don't ask, don't tell was a big deal. But before that, they allowed women to come on board ships and into combat roles. And so initially it was all male ships. I was assigned to an aircraft carrier. At my first ship, upon joining, it was all men. And my next ship went to shore duty from there. My next ship started off all men the same, and they changed the rule. Now they're going to bring women on board ships, on board combat vessels. And let me tell you, the shift in giving direction and order to men only to bringing women on board and giving direction, to a mixed gender crew was significantly different because there was still that measure of inferiority. Thankfully, David, someone told me, her name was Juanita Bennett. She told me in my second tour in the Navy, she said, this misogyny is the same thing as racial discrimination. And my first thought was, you got to be kidding me. A Black woman, like an aunt to me, she was maybe 10, 15 years older than me. And she said, it is. It's the same thing. And of course, at that time, I was just in opposition to that. However, it was still a seed that was planted. And thankfully, I considered that. And when I got to the ship and they changed that rule, and the next thing you know, there were women on board, whoa, it was a harsh, real connection to the language that she used. And so it made me think, I've got to be more altruistic. I've got to be more considerate of all of us being successful rather than just one group or another, particularly a group that has an advantage at the time, that would be the men. And so I just somehow became a champion. I had 5 aunts that were a big part of my grooming and raising me growing up. And so I know women are strong. I know that they're brilliant. I know that they can do all the things that men can do in most capacities. And so I became a champion, for them, because I realized that this measure of discrimination that we were applying to them was just wrong. And so my intention was to be that person. Well, next thing you know, don't ask, don't tell. Yet another opportunity. I'm still, again, I started 4 days in, and so I had been leading groups of people since then. And when women came on board the ship, there's about 50 or so folks that I was responsible for. When Don't Ask, Don't Tell began, so I was probably about 100 folks that were, under, my cognizance and my leadership. And so that was a really, really tough time because personally, it was contrary to my own belief system. I mean, again, born in the 60s, raised in the 70s, homosexuality, the LGBTQ community was not one that was embraced. And Oklahoma was the Bible Belt, by the way. And so what that means is that most folks during that era were serious Christian believers, not just saying that they were Christians. I mean, going to church 2 or 3 times a week and so forth. And so when that change happened, internally, there was a bit of strife for me, to be very honest with you. And it was very challenging. However, same thing applies. I thought coming into the Navy was going to be a meritocracy. It wasn't. I thought that no one else should have to endure that. And so again, though I was juxtaposed to the thought of that community, personally, what I knew is that dignity and respect was going to be maintained as much as possible in every area that I had influence. And then came the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and so there was always something socially that was happening within the Navy because it's a microcosm society. And it was very tricky at first, but it became very simple in the end. We should all be treated with dignity and respect. And as I interact, and I have served with all the other services, and so as I interacted with those other services, I was able to take their ideas and use them when it comes down to, theoretically how we should lead and groom and create this environment of growth for others and create synergy and synchronicity amongst all of us. And, thankfully, I had those connections with those other services so that I could get a different perspective because, knowledge of one thing is ignorance. And so if all I knew was, the Navy, then I would be a less effective leader. And thankfully, again, those other services were willing to be a part of my leadership experience. Super long answer. Oh my goodness. But I hope that answers the question.
It does. It was a really interesting answer as well. There's some great parallels there, I think, between those different I say great parallels, interesting parallels that are worth discussion. Between those different types of discrimination over the course of your career. And it's very easy, isn't it, to put one group in a box and just be ignorant around that group and then have a different set of rules for a different group in a different box. But I think what your experience and the way you've told that story really highlights is that discrimination is the same. It doesn't matter really what group you're discriminating against. It's the same mentality. It's the same impact on that group. And I think, don't ask, don't tell is quite an interesting one as well from an academic and political perspective.
Very true.
For a lot of people, it was quite insulting. For a lot of others, it was a step forward because, of course, if I've understood it correctly anyway, prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, if you were homosexual or LGBTQ, you just couldn't serve at all.
Correct.
And if it was found out that you were and you were hiding it, you're out, right? Whereas,
and it was a hard road out.
Yeah, so I guess in that respect, it could have been seen as a step forward. It was perhaps a political half measure because it was easier that than allowing people to serve openly. That would have been too politically difficult to get over, I guess.
And I say, David, it, even more than political, and just kind of calibrate my lexicon, right? When I say political, I mean that treating people with dignity and respect, and operating with integrity, not a feint. And so when we just couldn't have started off with, okay, you're eligible to serve openly, because my peers were not necessarily that we didn't all necessarily have the same perspective. We did not all have the same values when it comes down to treating others with dignity and respect. The wailing and gnashing of teeth when women were brought on board combat ships is staggering. I mean, I won't even repeat some of the things and the perspective that was thought at the highest levels of leadership. And then when the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy came, and people began to, express themselves in a non-standard way. Let me tell you something. The measure of violence that was used, and again, we're a warfighting unit. I mean, please don't get that mixed up. There's a lot of, finger to forehead, you'll do as I say type of communication that went on, because, hazing was a known good technique to get people to do things that they wouldn't normally do. And so for those groups that were coming in, the same as for me, those groups who came in and were maltreated because they were different, whether it be gender or whether it be preference, it was vicious. And if we would have, I think that it was, if I could go back and have a conversation with Bill Clinton and his team and whoever it was who decided we should go with this Don't Ask, Don't Tell business, I'd be curious as to what type of social study that they did, because, the half measure was the appropriate measure. Because if they would have went, you can just openly serve, then the level of violence that was perpetrated upon those who chose to openly, express themselves would have been a slaughterhouse. Yeah, it was really violent.
I guess they were trying to avoid exactly that whilst still being able to have those people serve.
Somebody had a vision. It's so curious.
Yeah. And with women coming into the ship and the same kind of jobs as well, was that literally like an overnight thing? Like one day it wasn't allowed and the next day it was? And
well, no, thankfully we had learned, this rollout. And so even in, if we go even further back into World War II, where there were only certain ratings and only certain professions that blacks were able to serve in, for example. And so there is a very famous sailor by the name of Doris Miller, nicknamed Dory, big guy from Texas, as a matter of fact. He was on a battleship during the attack on Pearl Harbor in World War II, and there was damage to his ship, and he went up and he saved the captain of the ship and carried him physically, put him on his shoulder and carried him to safety. Then he went up and he manned a machine gun and shot down several kamikazes that were trying to attack the ship. And due to his heroic actions, the Navy just very recently is naming an aircraft carrier after this guy. But in that era, the only job he could do was be a cook or a serviceman. So he's either doing laundry or doing dishes, and because they didn't trust him to cook, doing laundry, doing dishes, period. And so later, they integrated minorities and Black people into various different jobs in the Navy. They realized that they just couldn't go one day from having, you're only allowed to be a cook to now you're able to be, do these administrative functions or do these technical functions, with weaponry and things like that. And so, and with computers, which is where I came in. So that was a transition that we learned. So when it came to bringing women on board ships, a year ahead of time, by the way, starting on this date, we're going to start allowing women on ships. And because the differences between men and women, there were things that needed to be changed on the ship. I mean, we had to change the bathroom facilities. We had to change the sleeping facilities and all those, types of things, urinals, and were proliferated throughout this aircraft carrier, by the way. And so many of those had to be removed and so on, those type of accommodations. And so it was about at least a 1 year, rollout in the change and preparation. Not so much when it came down to the don't ask, don't tell. That was a little bit faster and a little bit more surprising than the bringing women on board combatant ships.
Which makes sense in a way, because I suppose there's going to be less practical changes required, because it's literally just nothing really changes except if you find out someone is, then they don't get fired anymore.
Right. Exactly. Right. The risk of, let's say the person, who is LGBTQ, goes from having to what we call keep it in the closet, to being able to, at the repeal, being able to unfurl, what had been hidden in the closet. And again, the risk of doing that was still, because though the rule was we're not going to kick you out of the Navy and take away your rights and so forth, you're still going to have to deal with the ostracism and the challenges that people do dumb stuff, particularly when you're trapped in your own mind and the way you think things ought to be done. And that's when leadership is just so important. When I recently released a book called Building Resilience for Hybrid Success. And I talk about the importance of building resilience within an organization. So through all of these things, through all of these changes, I had the opportunity to lead and to see others leading, and the techniques that go with, how to do it right and how to never do it that way, were just abound. They were all over the place. And what I realize and know is that if we start with treating people with dignity and respect, if we start with expressing a measure of care for one another, and if those are the staples of who we are as leaders, we can endure anything. And so even as we consider just recently coming out of this global pandemic, and then the changes that happen within organizations, some are in the hybrid environment, some have gone completely, to working remotely. Others are demanding, that their members come back to work. In the United States, we call it the RTO, return to office. And so it's an interesting environment. But as we endure those things in the history of our Navy and in our society, and through George Floyd, by the way. And so George Floyd here in the United States was murdered on the street. It was on video, and it created a civil unrest, and it created a lot of activism. So leading, through those challenges, or I should say, making our way successfully through those challenges only happens with strong leadership.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think particularly some of the challenges and those periods of history when you were serving in your career, it's easy for us now to look back and say, well, doesn't make any difference. Like, as a leader, I don't care, as long as all I'm really focusing on is the output. But I think that overlooks the context of the time that you had to work within. And it must have been an incredibly difficult series of changes to navigate as a leader. So, yeah, I mean, I can only applaud it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The ostracism is real, and, people, the good thing is, again, in the military branches, and I think the Air Force, full disclosure, I think the United States Air Force probably does the best of it, the best job of all of us when it comes down to accepting change. And it's really, really tough because, our brains are wired for sameness. We want, the same thing over and over. I know, grabbing this chocolate bar is going to give me a dopamine, serotonin release, and I'm going to take a bite out of this chocolate bar over and over because I know I'm going to get that same hit. Whereas I also know that it's going to create, other health problems that go along with, overeating chocolate. And so I'm fighting with my mind is fighting, with my brain. So my brain knows better, but my mind wants that hit. And so when it comes because we're wired for sameness, that is what makes people, cleave to those things that we're changing from. And so there was a time when we needed men to be, barrel chested and, firm, in their decision making. And then the era then became, where we are now, where everybody, has got a creative way that may make us all better. And so let's do that.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we could keep talking about the social phenomena surrounding these issues for probably an hour just on that. So we better move on. So a cliche that I've not used in quite some time now is that change is the only constant. And I think from the story you've just told us about all the changes in your career in service, that's pretty clear. But the next big change for you, I guess, would have been leaving the service and making that transition to private business. Tell us a bit about that and some of the challenges and the learning opportunities that you discovered in that process.
Sure. Let me start with community. Oh my goodness. Community is so, so important. After living that regimented life for over 3 decades, what I wasn't prepared for is the silence, the quiet that comes with being outside of that organization that I've been with since I was 17 years old. And thankfully, I had friends and family that were waiting on me, to retire. And not long after my retirement, which is in 2019, the pandemic hit. But again, thankfully, I had a weightlifting community that I was a part of. I began to, once the gyms closed in the Virginia area, DC, where I was living at the time, because I'm a creature of habit. I'm up early in the morning, normally up before everyone else, so I can go to the gym and have my own private time and then, start the day with other human beings. I still had that habit, but the gym was closed. And so I started running. And even though it was, non-spoken environment, it was a group of runners who would be out around the same time of morning. And it was the hellos and the hand waves, that community of people that allowed me to make my way through the transition. And also because I retired, that it was a environment of, well, what do I want to do now? And so I'm traveling around playing golf with my buddies and doing all those things that they say you're supposed to do in retirement. But it was also a time that I realized, this gift that allowed me to make my way through the Navy, the ability to communicate with people and help others see themselves in a different light and help leaders see their teams in different lights so that they can grow them out to be the best people that they can be, was not something I should be sitting on. And so I had already established Kemp Solutions as my business, and I had done some speeches, but I was like, well, I should probably do more. So I joined several organizations that allowed me to get certifications, from resilience building leadership program to the Y Institute. I'm a certified John Maxwell speaker, coach, and trainer. And so that allowed me to continue to stimulate my mind and to learn, because I think we should continuously be growing. And it allowed me to build even more community and meet more people. Not everyone who is, like-minded per se, but it was still an opportunity to get different perspectives on things that were important to me. I started Kemp Solutions with the intention of changing the world. Kind of simple. I want to change the world from the workplace outward. And the strategy is to teach leaders how to communicate well, to create that environment of character within the organization, and then to create a combat ready, member within their organization. So before we go into combat, we train, we retrain, then we train. I'm not sure if you heard me, but I said we train. And we train so that, in that combat environment, we're fully ready. So how much better would an organization, let's say like Novo Construction, be if they take their leaders, they create that environment where we're highly proficient at building trust. We're highly proficient at building collaboration within the organization and inclusion. How much better would they be if they do those things that I know as a leader who's executed those things, it works. And so that has been the transition for me, and learning to help leaders understand, get rid of my Navy jargon. So it's like you see the helm over my shoulder. I would rather teach someone that the helm it's more like a steering wheel for a ship rather than whatever they might have thought it was beforehand. But then I need to, change, my lexicon to vernacular to match, their thinking as well. So if I describe myself as a fleet master chief, and their expression normally means, exactly what that means. And I can tell them, like, if you imagine if your head HR person first had to be, your CTO, your chief technological officer, and then they also had to be the COO before they came to HR person. That is that, amalgam, that group of people there. That's who the fleet master chief actually is. And so then we can begin a conversation from there. So a lot of the transition has been very interesting, but to your point, I like the change, and I like figuring things out, on the fly. I don't mind building a plane in flight, and that's what it's been.
Well, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, the timing of it, it's good that you had people around you to help, because I can imagine going from basically being institutionalized in the Navy and always having loads of people around, I can assume.
Right. Very true.
And then suddenly in business by yourself, and then COVID and a lockdown, and you're not allowed to see anyone else on top of that. I mean, that could have been pretty punishing, I imagine.
No doubt. Yeah. Thankfully, the across from Virginia to Texas, the golf courses stayed open. So you couldn't ride the golf court because you didn't want to touch stuff that other people were touching. But, at least I had a push cart. So that worked out okay.
Yeah. And golf you can play by yourself if you have to as well. So,
exactly.
Yeah, interesting. Had a much smaller scale, but similar kind of challenge myself on that time, because I left my previous job towards the end of 2019. And then I started the business, and then 5 months later, COVID hit and lockdown. And yeah, I mean, that could have gone pretty horribly wrong, being used to working with people and having a team, and then having to stay at home all the time by me and the wife.
Right.
It was, I think actually that was good for me. I think I needed the headspace at the time. So sure. I was lucky as well.
Good deal. Look at that.
Yeah, indeed. So I'm curious to know, what has been your best experience of being led?
The best experience of being led for me came in two experiences. One happened at the very beginning of my career. The next one happened at the 10-year mark. So in the very beginning of my career, as I mentioned earlier, the Navy was slow to integrate compared to other services, and that includes professions. And so I joined the Navy as what we called a data processing technician back then. Now it's an IT professional. And because there just weren't many blacks in that field, when I got to my first ship, I was a bit of a unicorn. A super short story. I'll make it as short as possible. So I got to the ship. I was supposed to go to the computer room, and the person responsible for transitioning us into the areas where we're supposed to work, he told me, and remember that I said there's this word that's so polarizing in the United States, we don't even use the word, right? He said, I don't allow any, N-word folks to go into the computer room. So you are going to go down here and you'll do this manual labor with the rest of them boys down there. And so I said, okay. And what he meant for my harm was actually turned out to work out for my good, because what happened is when I got down there, and it's only blacks in this, mostly blacks in this particular workspace. My goal joining the Navy was to make it to E5 so I could retire. And so I saw, the first black E5 I had ever seen before. In the Navy, the rank structure is, E1 through 9, and then O1 through 9. And so I was enlisted, so the E designator. And so I saw E5 and I was like, oh, well, if he did it, I know he'll help me so I can do it too. And I saw an E6. I was like, what? E6? If he can do it, surely I can do it. And I met this guy named Harpo. He was the E5. And his name is Anthony Harps. He's actually the librarian at the Naval Academy right now. And he said, I heard him say to somebody else, man, Kemp might be the one. He might be the one. And that stimulated some belief in me that, man, I might be the one. Now, I know what the one was, but it was something. And it was something special. And so I thought, wow, I wonder if I'm the one. I got to walk that out. And his foresight, and not saying that always privily, sometimes saying that in my proximity was a measure of leadership brilliance that I just didn't know at the time. Plant that seed early, water it often, and see what happens. Later in my career, about the 10-year mark, I met this guy named Fred Hyde, and he expressed not just a level of care for who I was as a man and my family and those things that I was, making my way through personally. He also held me to an account and to a standard, and he spoke life. And he told me that the words that he said to me was that the Navy has done all we can do for you. The rest is up to you. The Navy has a competency, test for your professional, your job knowledge. And I think that's fair. And what he was essentially saying is that you're doing all these things masterfully. You're leading people in a great way, but this test, you need to study for and figure that out. And because in the Black community in the United States, an inferior education system was just very clearly in place, I felt as if I had been, at a disadvantage. What he reminded me and encouraged me to believe is that there was no disadvantage. You can figure it out. And right after my interaction with him, I was able to make it to, that next promotion based on the test. And what Harps, we call him Harpo, what Anthony Harps had said to me, what he had said to me early in my career, now I had the opportunity to grow that into something special, because now I had the rank and the belief. And, I mentioned before we came on air that I believe that there's a phrase, the rising tide floats all boats. Well, I'm the tide.
That's a great story, I have to say. And there's so many key bits of leadership in there as well, like right from the start, like inspiring you towards achieving something to loftier heights, leading by example, having been there and done it himself first as well. Developing people, helping you to achieve the test, the next thing, always having your eyes on that future. But also, and it's a common theme that I hear almost every time I ask the question, actually, it's the power, the value of having that supportive leader who's there, who's got your back, who's, lets you stand on their shoulders. Insert other cliches here.
Yeah. It's so true. I often speak about the ABCs of leadership from my perspective, are attitude, belief, and character, right? Mm-hmm. Attitude, your attitude is going to determine your altitude. If you believe you can achieve and show up with character every time, whether someone's watching or not, that those ABCs of leadership, when people express that, when they feel that, when they're allowed, when that leader picks them up and hikes them up on their shoulders and allows them to see, what the future may be, game changer, absolute game changer.
Definitely. So tell us your best piece of advice for a new leader or a first-time manager.
Ooh. Yeah. So my best advice for those who are walking into a leadership role that may be their first one ever or their greatest one thus far in their career is there's 4 things that fast learning organizations do really well. They see, they solve, they share, and they provide feedback. See, solve, share, provide feedback. Innovative ideas oftentimes come from people who are, and solutions to problems oftentimes come from people who are closest to the problem. And so it's important to create an environment of trust for the members to realize that their ideas will be heard. When you create the environment of trust, that's going to yield an environment of inclusion, because if you know that you're heard, you feel a part of solutions. And that, goes on to collaboration. It goes on to adaptability, and then finally to growth within the organization. So my highest encouragement and piece of advice to young leaders who are taking on new roles and responsibilities is to very intentionally build trust within that group and a measure of inclusion so that the organization will be a benefit of those of your leadership.
100%. Yeah, I really like that whole concept of the person who's doing the job, who's at the coalface in the old language, as it were. Right. They know the most about the problem. So if you're not listening to their point of view, their solutions, their ideas, you're missing a trick, and you're probably going to take, at best, a lot longer to solve that problem.
Right. Very true. Very true.
Okay, potentially difficult question for you now. We'll see how you get on with it.
Yep.
If you could start your career again, would you do anything differently?
If my first thought is, heck no, I do it the exact same way. I want all them hard lessons learned. I want to do it all. I was at the top. What could be better? So one thing I would do differently I would aspire to do differently would be to be a better listener. I think there were opportunities to hear perspective and to listen that I really missed out on. There was I had to operate with a really high level of confidence because of the skin I was in. And so I had to work twice as hard for half the credit, oftentimes being undervalued and underestimated in the preponderance of what I was doing. And so because of that, there may have been, I know without a doubt, there were times that I had the opportunity to hear something that I just couldn't because my own drum was beating so loud. And so if I could, go back in time and restart, or if I could just whisper in the ear, to my younger self, it would be a better listener and realize that your attitude is what's going to get you there, not necessarily your ability. So yeah, I've never been asked that question before, but it's stimulating to my mind and a little bit emotional about some of those voices who were guiding me in a direction that would be beneficial to me, and then sometimes the opportunity to grow a person or create that space for someone that I didn't yield to until later in my career. I sort of figured it out, but wow, if I could have learned that sooner, there's no telling what might happen.
Listening is one of those things, isn't it? I think it's one of the most common skills overlooked by leaders. I think, especially early career, where you feel like you've got to be the one doing all the talking all the time to demonstrate your value, your knowledge, whatever. Right. And I think so much of communication, though, is it has to be a two-way street, doesn't it? Like, otherwise it's just transmission, not communication.
So it's a monologue and not a dialogue, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's a really important lesson, 100%.
Leadership Heroes.
I've only got one question left for you, and this is almost always my favorite question. It's called Leadership Heroes. So my question is, if you could pick one person and they could be anyone you like, alive or dead, past or present, real or fictitious, if you wish, who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that person be and why?
What a great question. Especially when you include the fictitious, golly, that just opens up all kinds of.
Or is it a red herring? Who knows?
Right. Excellent. I would say if I could go back, and I think the most celebrated person in the history of the world, regardless of background, faith, or religion, is this. Some might say a character. I would say a man known as Jesus the Christ. And so I would be curious to go back in time and have a dialogue, have a true conversation where I could ask questions and hear responses to how do we unite? How do we build and grow and create community? That rising tide, as I mentioned before, how do we get to that egalitarian, altruistic, measure of commitment to one another, treating each other, the way we want to be treated and with love. I would be very, very curious to, especially if I can come back, and I don't want to go there and stay. I mean, if I had to go there and stay, I'd probably go talk to somebody else. But if I could come back, if I could go and come back and bring that knowledge with me and share it with others, because truly, success to me is finding a better way and sharing it with others. And how I do that is by challenging the status quo. But what my intention is to always bring a contribution to another person or to an organization. And so from my perspective, his thoughts and beliefs in that 3-year window that we get a glimpse of his life, I want to hear about, the years that led up to that and what can we use, in this era to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I agree. He is a very good example. He's been picked before quite a few times, unsurprisingly. Right. So I'm afraid you don't get your bonus points for a new choice. But I think what I like about Jesus in particular, whether you believe in him from a religious aspect or you think he's a historical figure, or you just think it's a nice story with some lessons in it.
Right.
Either way, regardless of your perspective, it's a great example of servant leadership, of always putting his people first, which I think in the modern business setting is a really important skill for any leader. And just the perspective of bringing people together as well and inspiring that greater vision and leaving that legacy that his followers then carried on afterwards, for a few thousand years and counting.
Right.
It's, it's such a great example of leadership in so many different aspects. Almost, regardless of your perspective, as I say. So, thank you. Great choice. Can't argue with it.
That's a dope question.
Yeah, I like it. That's why it's my favorite question. But well, Raymond, it's been an absolute privilege talking with you today. I've really enjoyed hearing all of your perspectives, your stories from your career, and everything else we've talked about. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights. The last little question I have for you is if any of the listeners want to know more about you, perhaps work with you, get a copy of your book, all of the above, where can they find it?
Yes. So the book is on Amazon. It's called Building Resilience for Hybrid Success, Anchored in Adaptability. And if you'd like to reach out to me individually, the best place would be to go over to LinkedIn and look up Raymond Kemp. Just put that into this search, Raymond Kemp Sr., and you'll see my name pop up. I'm also on social media as Raymond D. Kemp, and that's on X and Instagram and Facebook. And my webpage is www.kemp-solutions.com. Again, that's Kemp, techsolutions.com. And please know my encouragement is going to be, how can we be better? And I want you to keep in mind that there's 10 two-letter words that help us do that. Those words are, if it is to be, it is up to me. Let's go.
Nice. Okay. Thank you. And I'll pop all of those links in the episode description so people can find it easily. And I do encourage listeners to click on it and learn more.
Great.
Well, that's it. That's all we've got time for. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Been a pleasure, David.
Well, that was an important and interesting conversation, listener. I hope you gained a lot from it as much as I have. Thank you again to Raymond for his time and his insights. Really do appreciate you being on the show today, and I've no doubt everyone listening is going to get loads of value from it. If you would like to learn more about Raymond, get in touch with him. I do encourage you to do that. You'll find links to his LinkedIn profile and his website in the show notes in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to those of you who've left us reviews and ratings and who are supporting the podcast. All of you are recognized and appreciated, and it's great to hear all of your feedback. That's pretty much all I've got time for today. Just to say, join me again tomorrow when I will be talking with Summer Jelinek about a management career at Disney and beyond, about her new book, what inspired her interest in leadership, and much more. Not one that you want to miss. So I hope you'll be back. I certainly will be. And until then, remember, be a leader, not a boss.